Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, February 16, 2022. White House, State Department, and NATO all saying there is still no sign that Russia is de-escalating at Ukraine's borders, and it seems that Russia is actually adding military forces. Russia continues to deny that and accuses Western media of inciting hysteria about a war, noting that today was the day that several news outlets claimed the attack was to begin. President Joe Biden denies an executive privilege claim by former President Donald Trump for White House visitor logs, ordering the National Archives to turn them over to the House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. We'll talk to a reporter with The Hill about that. CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky saying her agency is looking into changing which metrics are used to determine the severity of an outbreak like COVID-19 in order to, in her words, give people a break from things like mask wearing when these metrics are better. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau defending his use of emergency powers to clear the streets in Ottawa and the crossings between Canada and the U.S. of protesters against COVID restrictions, primarily vaccine mandates. This as leaders of the opposition parties in this country say they're not going to support this move. Reporting from Reuters, the United States and NATO saying Russia was still building up troops around Ukraine on Wednesday, despite Moscow's insistence it was pulling back, questioning President Vladimir Putin's stated desire to negotiate a solution to the crisis. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was on ABC News' Good Morning America.
The Russians said again this morning that they're continuing to pull back troops from the border. Yesterday, the president said he was skeptical about that. Are you seeing any evidence that this is being done in a real and significant way?
We're not. And unfortunately, there's a difference between what Russia says and what it does. And what we're seeing is no meaningful pullback. On the contrary, we continue to see forces, especially forces that would be in the vanguard of any renewed aggression against Ukraine, continuing to be at the border, to mass at the border.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken interviewed by ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos this morning. State Department later confirming that Blinken will attend the Munich Security Conference in Germany on Friday to talk about Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. In this afternoon, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki asked at her daily briefing about Blinken's claim and what it means, and also about the prediction today was going to be the day that Russia invaded.
Secretary of State Blinken today said that he has seen evidence that Vladimir Putin is actually moving critical military assets toward the border with Ukraine and not away from the border, as Putin has claimed. So does the administration believe that Putin is actually escalating this crisis in real time?
Well, I think as Secretary Blinken also said, the Russian troops remain massed in a very threatening way at the border. And he was responding, I believe, to a good question about whether they were delivering on what they had promised yesterday. And the answer was no. There's what Russia says, and there's what Russia does, and we're watching very closely what steps they're taking, but they remain amassed in a threatening way at the border.
There has not yet been, to our awareness, an actual invasion. This date had been circled on the calendar as one that this administration, that other governments worldwide were watching very closely. What do you make of the fact that at this point, it is now darkness in that region, there hasn't been a military invasion?
Well, Kristen, without getting into any intelligence or conversations we would have with allies or partners, what we had conveyed last week, and you heard Jake Sullivan convey very clearly, is that we were in the window. We remain in the window.
And is there still as much hope for diplomacy today? Is there more hope? Where does that thinking stand?
Of course, the door continues to be open to diplomacy. Secretary Blinken spoke with Foreign Minister Lavrov yesterday. Jake Sullivan speaks with his Ukrainian counterpart nearly every day, if not every day. We remain. The president, of course, is going to speak with Chancellor Scholz later this afternoon. So it is moving forward, diplomatic conversations on many channels.
The White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki with reporters in the White House briefing room. It was Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky who said earlier this week that he had been informed that February 16th would be the day of the attack by Russia on Ukraine. An advisor to that president later clarifying Zelensky was being ironic and only referring to the date already reported by other press outlets. In Ukraine today, yellow and blue national flags fluttering and the country's national anthem playing to mark Unity Day, a holiday declared by President Zelensky. A spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry, Maria Zakharova held her own news conference today, suggesting that the reported date of an attack not being true, she says, is the latest warmongering by Western nations and media.
Today we are celebrating another day on which the Russian Federation did not attack Ukraine. A new day that will bring us closer to this war that everyone in the West, Washington and London first of all, promised to us. They even published photos of this allegedly happening war. Bloomberg and CNN have published materials on this. CBS have published a particularly silly material. The Sun and other tabloids were also notorious. To the regret of these media, the war never came. It would have been laughable, but still, it's scary for the entire world because we are speaking about a war. Of course, they try to do everything that is in their power to ensure that the war breaks out. And perhaps the fighting in the pages of their newspapers was serious indeed.
Maria Zakharova, Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, through an interpreter, of course, at a news conference. While Russia has consistently denied that it will invade Ukraine, it has warned it could take unspecified military technical action if its security demands are not met, those demands including restricting NATO expansion. Defense secretaries and ministers from NATO countries meeting today at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, representing the United States, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and ahead of the meeting, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg taking reporters' questions.
Yeah, Jonathan Beale, BBC Secretary General. Russia has again said it's moved some of its forces, withdrawn some of its forces. Are you essentially saying you do not believe them? And the second question is, you have expressed grounds for cautious optimism on the diplomatic track. Given that the situation on the ground doesn't seem to have changed, why do you have that optimism?
I think the message and the signs we heard from Moscow yesterday provides some grounds for cautious optimism, because that was a message about diplomacy, and we have been ready for diplomatic efforts, talks with Russia throughout this crisis, and we have stated that again and again, and we have conveyed our proposals to Russia in written, and we are waiting for their response. But at the same time, we have not seen any withdrawal of Russian forces, and of course that contradicts the message of real diplomatic efforts. So it remains to be seen whether there is a Russian withdrawal. We are of course monitoring very closely what Russia does in and around Ukraine. What we see is that they have increased the number of troops and more troops are on their way. So far, no de-escalation, but of course we hear also the messages about diplomacy, and we are ready to engage in diplomatic efforts with Russia.
The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg holding a short news conference ahead of today's meeting of defense ministers and secretaries of NATO countries. Stoltenberg also announcing that NATO is considering deploying further battle groups to Eastern and Central Europe. Guardian newspaper in Britain explains they would complement those established in 2014 in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, led by the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, and the United States. And the French government has offered to lead a force in Romania. Also today, hundreds more U.S. paratroopers arriving in Poland near the Ukrainian border, an airport there. The U.S. says it is planning to temporarily deploy about 4,700 additional soldiers to Poland, bringing the total U.S. military presence there to about 10,000 troops. President Biden and leaders of other NATO countries promising swift and severe sanctions against Russia if it does invade Ukraine. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul asked today if such a threat can be effective against Russian President Vladimir Putin. McFaul was before the House Oversight and Reform Subcommittee on National Security here in Washington. You're also then going to hear a question to another witness, former acting Director of National Intelligence in the U.S., Richard Grenell, about why President Biden lifted sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. Subcommittee Chair asking first to Michael McFaul, Congressman Stephen Lynch, Democrat of Massachusetts.
When I hear the dialogue coming out of NATO about, economic sanctions against Russia for eliminating borders and invading Ukraine and, taking away the self-determination, self-government of 44 million people. The idea that, we're going to put a price on that can be taken a completely different way by authoritarian regimes. We have in the background China that's always playing the long game. If we said that there'd be economic costs for taking Taiwan, or in this case, economic costs of taking Ukraine, and we put that out there as our response. There are some authoritarian leaders who play the long game, might just try to amortize those costs and go forward with taking other countries. And so I'm just concerned about, at the outset, putting economic prices on the actions of these authoritarian regimes. And it seems like we've stepped back from considerably from the Truman Doctrine. And I just wonder the wider question, the macro issue of protecting democracy and that international system. Ambassador McFaul or Dr. Kendall Taylor, do you have any insights on that?
Sure. Let me say a couple of things. A great hard question. The first thing I want to talk about is Putin and then us. So with Mr. Putin, I think it's important to remember that the Russian system is a dictatorship. It's not a democracy. That, we tend to think in cost benefit analysis, if he invades or not, what's going to be the cost to his economy. He's not subject to pressures from the oligarchs or other constituencies in the same way it would be in a democracy. I think that's very important to understand. Number two, I think he thinks of his mission in life in more ideological terms and more sweeping terms. He thinks about his mortality already. And therefore, what happens in the short term is not as important to him. So worrying about the prices of Bearbank's stock next week is not something on his mind in the way it might be for investors. That's the first thing I would say. My own personal view on sanctions is that we haven't done enough. And I go back to 2014. In my view, I left the administration right as Mr. Putin seized Crimea. But that was the moment when we should have put in comprehensive sanctions. And two things. We talked about Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 has been building for several years, everyone. It didn't just pop up this year. I think we should have been sanctioning Nord Stream 2 a lot longer, years ago. And number three, another thing, which I know nobody supports, but I want you to know, Congressman, my view is that sanctions need to be like parking tickets. The way we think about them now is somebody does something bad and we give them a parking ticket and then we just let them park there forever. So Crimea. Whereas my view is they have to ratchet up. Here at Stanford, if you park, and believe me, it only takes 15 minutes to get a parking ticket here at Stanford, and you leave your car there the next day, guess what, Congressman? You get another parking ticket. And if you're there for a week, you get 7 parking tickets. And I think that construction, that if you're violating sovereignty, if you're at war, you need to ratchet up the pressure, not just have one level of pressure and leave it in place. But I know that's very unpopular. One last thing about sanctions, I would say. My own view in this crisis was that we should have publicized the sanctions we were planning to do with our NATO allies and European partners, in part so that Putin knew for sure, but in part for the Russian people to know for sure what we were going to do. And third, in part, to tie our hands. I think the worst thing to do in a crisis is to have a long debate about which sanctions we're going to do or not. If you publicize them, then you have to credibly commit to enforcing them if it happens. The Biden administration had a different view. They thought that by publicizing them, that would lead to a big debate within the alliance. And I respect that argument, and I understand that argument, but I had a different view earlier on.
Okay, thank you. I see my time has expired, and I now recognize my colleague, the ranking member, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thanks. We'll start off with Mr. Grinnell. Last year, President Biden lifted the sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Do you want to comment on that, or your opinion as to why President Biden would drop the sanctions and the effect of it?
Yeah, look, I think that consensus is a really nice word. It really sounds good, but my 8 years inside the UN Security Council will tell you that consensus is more times than not, almost exclusively, terrible for the United States. It's a watered down statement. It's a watered down set of policies. It's the lowest common denominator of what people believe. Now, I want to respond a little bit to why we didn't publicize the possible sanctions from the ambassador. The main reason is because the Germans were against it. And Joe Biden and the Biden administration have decided that we have to act in concert with the Europeans on this, and therefore the Germans are really watering down our response. I would argue that we don't share the same threat assessment that Berlin and Paris and Brussels do. I'm all for a transatlantic alliance as long as it's Western facing. There's no reason to just be in an alliance that ignores the West. What we need is a strong statement of these are the sanctions that would be put in place. And we weren't able to do that. We weren't able to do that because what the Biden team maximizes is consensus with people who don't share the same threat assessment that we do.
Richard Grinnell is a former acting director of national intelligence, served 2019 through 21 under former President Trump. Questioned by Congressman Glenn Grothman, Republican from Wisconsin, ranking member on the National Security Subcommittee of House Oversight and Reform Committee. You also heard from another witness, Michael McFaul, who was U.S. Ambassador to Russia 2012 through 14 under former President Obama. Questioned by the subcommittee chair, Stephen Lynch, a Democrat from Massachusetts. You can find today's entire hearing covered by C-SPAN archived at our video library at cspan.org. From the Washington Post, President Biden has ordered visitor logs from the White House during President Donald Trump's tenure to be turned over to the House Select Committee investigating the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, an order the National Archives said Wednesday it would carry out by March 3rd. The former president claimed the logs were subject to executive privilege. In a letter Tuesday, a White House lawyer rejected the claim, saying the National Archives should provide the records within 15 days to the House committee. That was from the Washington Post. Some reaction from Senator Dick Durbin, the Judiciary Committee chair on Capitol Hill.
I just first want to get your reaction just to the news of the day, the White House ordering the release of visitor logs from January 6th to assist the January 6th committee. What is your take on that? What insight, if any, do you think that could provide on what happened that day?
Serious questions have been raised about whether the documents, federal documents that are required to be kept on some of these situations in the Trump administration were in fact created and preserved. So I think the Biden White House has made it clear they want to be transparent, and they're trying to help the committee realize what happened.
Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, chairs the Judiciary Committee with reporters outside the committee hearing room. Another Democratic committee member also stopping by, Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut.
In terms of the Biden administration just requested Trump visitor logs be turned over to the 1-6 committee in the House. The former president has said that's a violation of executive privilege. What do you make of that assertion, and also the request by the Biden administration for those visitor logs to be turned over?
I know it will be a surprise to Mr. Trump, but this administration actually believes in following the law. The president is not king, and no one in our government has absolute power to decide what the public sees or not. Transparency is required here, And there is no reason that some executive privilege should prevent the public and the courts from seeing what's appropriate for disclosure.
Senator Richard Blumenthal. More on the Trump White House visitor logs being turned over to the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol building. We're joined by Morgan Chalfant, White House correspondent for The Hill. Thank you for being with us. What is the reasoning the White House giving for rejecting former President Trump's claim of executive privilege regarding these logs?
So the White House counsel wrote a letter to the National Archives yesterday saying that the White House believes that Congress has a compelling need in service of its legislative functions to the documents to understand the January 6th attack. Now, this is a similar reasoning that they have used in prior instances where they've rejected former President Trump's claim of privilege. What's different about this letter, though, is because they're visitor logs. The White House counsel also wrote that under the Biden administration's current policy, which is to release most of these logs, that these documents would be released anyway. Now, of course, it was a change in policy. The Trump administration had stopped releasing those visitor logs, which had been released under Obama as a point of transparency. So that was one interesting part of the letter that caught my eye and that several news organizations have also highlighted.
Former President Trump unsuccessfully challenged turning over those other White House documents and records. Does that ruling apply here, or could there be a fresh court case?
So he could take it to court again. My educated guess would be that a similar result would unfold just because it's a similar question as it relates to executive privilege. There's no word yet on whether he is actually pursuing court action. So we're waiting to hear whatever the former president has to say about this.
What are in White House visitor logs? What kind of information, and what might the Select Committee learn from that information?
So these visitor logs are from January 6th of 2021 and perhaps around the time of that might be additional days as well. It will be the names of people that have come in that have been recorded as going into the White House. The White House counsel Deanna Remus's letter did note that there would be personal information that's in them redacted for privacy reasons as well. So names certainly of people, and it will give you more of a sense of who was talking to Trump, who was meeting with Trump on the day of the attack or the days around the attack. Obviously, there's been some public reporting of some of the, conversations that he's had and goings on. But I think it will give the committee a larger picture of who he was talking to that day and who would come in and out of the White House.
We're talking with Morgan Chalfant, White House correspondent with The Hill. The work of the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack has been mostly behind closed doors. We do expect some public hearings eventually. We're getting headlines every couple of days about what they're working on. Can you bring us up to date?
So they've received a lot of documents, and I think there was a Washington Post story today about a lot of the text messages that have been revealed from the White House Chief of Staff. So there have been a number of revelations of Mark Meadows' communications, and also there was a prominent a couple news stories about the text from Fox News hosts urging Trump to make a statement just denouncing the rioters on the day. But you're right, a lot of it has happened behind closed doors. There's been a lot of requests or subpoenas issued to people for interviews, for information. They've interviewed former White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany. And so I think that as the coming weeks and the months unfold, if we do start to see public hearings, we do see more information, there's expected to be some kind of report at some point. I think we'll have a fuller picture of really the body of information that they've gathered over the last couple of months.
Morgan Chalfant, White House correspondent for The Hill. Find her stories at thehill.com and on Twitter at mchalfant16. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for your time.
Back to Capitol Hill, outside the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room, Republican Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri Asked by reporters about this issue, Trump White House visitor logs being turned over to the Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol, Hawley did not answer that question, but instead brought up a different story, a legal filing from John Durham last week, special counsel appointed under former President Trump to investigate the FBI's probing of Russian interference in the 2016 election. And Durham saying that a tech executive exploited access to White House data in order to find damning information about former President Trump. Here's the question and answer, Senator Josh Hawley.
The Biden administration also just requested that Trump visitor logs be released to the 1/6 committee. The former president said that that's a violation of executive privilege. I mean, where do you stand on that? Is that a violation of the executive privilege?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I have no idea. But what I can tell you is that the Biden administration ought to be cooperating with Special Counsel Durham in his investigation into the illegal access of White House servers, the illegal access of emails at Trump Tower. The Biden administration has apparently paid the same hackers who hacked into the White House server and the Trump server illegally. They apparently were on the Biden campaign payroll in 2020. That's a big problem. So I assume the special counsel will be looking into that. I hope the White House will pledge now to be fully cooperative with the special counsel and to give him the information he needs. I mean, it's a serious set of crimes, and it's something that he's going to be getting to the bottom of, and I hope the president will pledge to cooperate with him.
Senator Josh Hawley with reporters. Former President Trump put out a statement saying the Durham investigation court filing provides indisputable evidence that my campaign and presidency were spied on by operatives paid by the Hillary Clinton campaign in an effort to develop a completely fabricated connection to Russia. Former President Trump also said that such conduct would have been punishable by death in a stronger period of time in this country. Washington Today continues in a minute.
Listen to C-SPAN Radio with our free mobile app, C-SPAN Now. Get complete access to what's happening in Washington, wherever you are, with live streams of floor proceedings and hearings from the U.S. Congress, White House events, the courts, campaigns, and more. Plus analysis of the world of politics with our informative podcasts. C-SPAN Now is available at the Apple Store and Google Play. Download it for free today. C-SPAN Now, your front row seat to Washington, anytime, anywhere.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, writes CNBC, is reviewing its mask guidance, shifting its focus to COVID hospitalizations as a key measure of the severity of the outbreak and future guide for determining whether health safety protocols need to be tightened. It's according to the agency's director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky. Walensky saying during a virtual White House COVID briefing today, we want to give people a break from things like mask wearing when the metrics are better. And this all comes as many governors across the country are dropping their indoor mask requirements. Here's Director Dr. Walensky.
As I said last week, we are looking at all of our guidance based not only on where we are right now in the pandemic, but also on the tools we now have at our disposal, such as vaccines, boosters, tests, and treatments, and our latest understanding of the disease. As we consider future metrics, which will be updated soon, we recognize the importance of not just cases, which continue to result in substantial or high community transmission in over 97% of our counties in the country, but critically, medically severe disease that leads to hospitalizations. We must consider hospital capacity as an additional important barometer. Our hospitals need to be able to take care of people with heart attacks and strokes. Our emergency departments can't be so overwhelmed that patients with emergent issues have to wait in line. We are assessing the most important factors based on where we are in the pandemic, and will soon put guidance in place that is relevant and encourages prevention measures when they are most needed to protect public health and our hospitals. We want to give people a break from things like mask wearing when these metrics are better, and then have the ability to reach for them again should things worsen. If and when we update our guidance, we will communicate that clearly, and it will be based on the data and the science. However, it's also important to remember, regardless of the level of disease burden in your community, there are still very important times to continue to wear your mask. If you're symptomatic or feeling unwell, you should wear a mask. If you're in the 10 days after a COVID diagnosis, you should wear a mask. If you were exposed to someone with COVID-19 and are quarantining, you should wear a mask. I know that everyone is anxious to move beyond this pandemic and some of the ways we have had to change the way we live over the last 2 years. We all share the same goal, to get to a point where COVID-19 is no longer disrupting our daily lives, a time when it won't be a constant crisis, rather something we can prevent, protect against, and treat.
Dr. Rochelle Walensky, Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, at today's White House COVID-19 response team briefing, a virtual briefing. She says coronavirus cases and hospitalizations in the U.S. dropping in recent weeks, but the raw numbers are still high. Each day, about 147,000 new infections, 9,500 hospital admissions, and 2,200 deaths. CDC also lowering the travel advisory for cruise ships from very high to high, recommending that people should be up to date on their COVID-19 vaccines, meaning both a primary shot and a booster if eligible. CDC has since late December recommended people avoid cruises completely. And the World Health Organization saying the number of new coronavirus cases worldwide fell by 19% last week, number of deaths remaining stable. The biggest number of new COVID cases seen in Russia. Prime Minister of Canada Justin Trudeau today defending his declaring a national emergency over trucker protests of COVID-19 restrictions in his country, principally the vaccine mandates. Protests are led by a group calling itself Freedom Convoy. They have gridlocked the Canadian capital city, Ottawa, and blockaded several U.S.-Canadian border crossings. During Prime Minister's question time in the House of Commons in Ottawa today, first questions coming from the opposition leader, Candice Bergen.
It's clear the Prime Minister has more of a political emergency on his hands than a national emergency. The borders at Coutts, Surrey, Windsor, and Emerson have all been cleared. There are no more blockades at any borders. Trucks are still here downtown in Ottawa, and they need to move. But in light of the rapidly changing landscape, can the Prime Minister tell us where is the serious threat of violence to Canadians for ideological purposes, which is the threshold that needs to be met for the Emergencies Act?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the invocation of the Emergencies Act is not something to be done lightly. It is not something to be done as a first resort or even a second resort. But it was necessary to be done to give local law enforcement across the country the tools to handle these illegal blockades, to be able to ensure restoration of order, and to make sure that Canadians, whether they're losing shifts or are seeing supplies delayed on the way through the borders, be able to get back to their daily lives. This is a decision we took, and of course, Parliament is going to have an opportunity to debate it.
Well, Leader of the Opposition.
Limitations to Canadians' fundamental freedoms must be justified and must meet a legal criteria. Experts across the country have said these requirements have not been met. The Prime Minister hasn't given Canadians a clear reason why he's invoking the Emergencies Act. In fact, things are de-escalating as we speak. So why is the Prime Minister using this hammer on Canadians? Isn't it true he's doing it just to save his own political skin?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, over the past few weeks, Canadians have been suffering, whether it's because of border crossings, whether it's because of illegal blockades in their neighborhoods. This is something that required extra tools that we have put in law enforcement's hands. Now, of course, law enforcement, the local law enforcement jurisdiction, can use these tools or not as they're available. But the threshold was met for the Emergencies Act, and now across the country, police of jurisdiction have the tools necessary to keep people safe.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau during Prime Minister's question time in the Canadian House of Commons in Ottawa today. Trudeau leads the Liberal Party. The opposition leader you heard from, Candice Bergen, is from the Conservative Party. And Ottawa police handing out leaflets to protesters today, ordering them to leave now, saying anyone blocking streets or assisting others in the blocking of streets are committing a criminal offense and you may be arrested. On Wall Street, the Dow down 54, NASDAQ down 15, S&P up 3. Story at the Washington Post, the White House and top Democratic lawmakers are beginning to weigh a new push for a federal gas tax holiday, potentially pausing fees at the pump as part of a broader campaign to combat rising prices. The early deliberations come days after a group of vulnerable Senate Democrats introduced a bill that would suspend the gas tax of roughly 18 cents per gallon for the rest of the year, a measure party lawmakers discussed at a lunch Tuesday. Asked about the proposal, the White House signaled that all options are on the table. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer did tell reporters after that Tuesday lunch that it is being considered.
Are you committed to putting a gas tax holiday bill on the Senate floor this year?
We had, as you know, I think 8 or 9 of our members have introduced this, including many of those in tough races in 2022. We're having a caucus discussion on it. We haven't yet taken a caucus position, but it's one of the things of many things that we're looking at in terms of reducing costs.
And Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, the majority leader with reporters on Tuesday, one of those senators who introduced that federal gas tax freeze bill, Mark Kelly of Arizona, explaining the rationale in an interview last week when the bill was introduced with a CBS TV affiliate in Phoenix.
Gasoline is incredibly expensive. It's some of the highest prices we've seen in nearly a decade. Families are struggling to afford not only gasoline, but things like, groceries, prescription medication. There's supply chain issues out there. Prices have gone up. And this is one thing we can do. This legislation can reduce the cost to families for gasoline, allow them to put that money towards other things they need. I mean, supplies for their kids going to school or, just basic daily groceries. So this is an important piece of legislation, and it's intended to, help people across the country.
Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat from Arizona, an interview with a TV station in Phoenix when he and other Senate Democrats introduced this bill last week. Today, a group of Senate Republicans held a news conference about high inflation, and they got asked about this idea of freezing the federal gas tax. You're going to hear from Senator Mike Crapo of Idaho and Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska.
Do you guys see potentially pausing the gas tax as a way to help with some of this inflation, to ease some of it?
Well, I'd say that each member of the Republican caucus probably could respond to that on their own. I don't know that there's a unanimous feeling, but my response is that trying to eliminate the gas tax is basically a gimmick. The price of gas is $1 higher. If you eliminated the gas tax, you would reduce 18 cents of that dollar, so there would be a step there. But what you would create is a greater amount of debt in the United States and a greater inability for us to finance our infrastructure. And financing our infrastructure is critical. Infrastructure spending is counter-inflationary. It is supply-side spending. And so they're going at the ability to finance the very kind of supply-side spending that could be helpful. So I personally think it's a bad idea, but I also think, frankly, it's just a gimmick.
Can I add to that? It's just, look at the context in which that bill has come up. Look at who introduced it. 4 very vulnerable U.S. senators who are all up for election right now. Why are they doing that? Because they're going home, like all of us, and they're hearing about the high costs of energy. They're hearing that. We're all hearing that. The way to deal with it is to support American energy production. They don't want to do that. The far left doesn't like that. This White House doesn't like that. So here's what they do. They show the bill they introduced and said, here's my plan. I'm really serious about this. It's a gimmick. It's political window dressing. That's all it is. And the notion that somehow that's going to fix it, fixing the energy costs, as many said here, these are self-inflicted wounds. We know it. We've seen it. And that is just political window dressing from some vulnerable U.S. senators who want to have something to cling to. But what they should cling to is convincing the White House to support American energy production. That's what they need to do.
Senator Dan Sullivan, Republican from Alaska. Before that, Senator Mike Crapo, Republican from Idaho. Crapo is the ranking Republican on the Finance Committee, which deals with taxes. AAA on Monday said that average gas prices in the U.S. now at $3.48 a gallon. That's up about $1 from the same time last year. From the New York Times, P.J. O'Rourke, the conservative satirist and political commentator who was unafraid to skewer Democrats and Republicans alike in best-selling books like Parliament of Whores, in articles for a wide range of magazines and newspapers, and on television and radio talk shows, died on Tuesday at his home in Sharon, New Hampshire. He was 74. One of his final books was A Cry from the Far Middle, Dispatches from a Divided Land, in 2020. And that year, he was interviewed by Cato Institute Vice President David Boaz, covered by C-SPAN.
Let's start by asking, what is the far middle?
Well, I think it's where we libertarians have always been, radical moderates, militant moderates even. We, get out of our way. We own the middle of the road. We've always found ourselves, I think everyone who feels himself to be a libertarian has always found him or herself to be caught between the poles of the angry left and the angry right, trying to be reasonable. In fact, it's not just the angry left and the angry right, it's just the regular left, or even the liberals and the regular right and the social conservatives. We've always gone straight down the middle, trying to use logic. And boy, we better get our message out right now, because the country seems to have lost any sense of that.
You know, way back in 1980, I traveled with the Libertarian presidential candidate, Ed Clark. And for a couple of days, Tom Reed of the Washington Post traveled with us. And he said, well, you guys are interesting, but you're so extreme, you'll never make it. And I said, you know what's extreme? Sending American boys to die in countries they've never heard of, taking half of a working man's wages. That's extremism.
Exactly. I mean, the idea that there's such a thing as an extreme libertarian is it's nonsense. What people mean when they say that is actually an anarchist, and none of us are in favor of anarchism. I mean, we're in favor of rule of law. We're in favor of the individual. We're in favor of individual liberty, individual dignity, and individual responsibility. That last one being a tougher sell point. But there is nothing anarchy. I spent 20 years as a war reporter. I've been to Mogadishu. I know exactly what anarchy looks like. And I think over this summer, some people in the United States got a little idea what anarchy looks like, how well it worked in Portland. It's not what we're about. If there's anything extreme about us, it's that we're extremely reasonable, that we try to think things through, that we try to apply logic to the heat and the heat and the swamp, the mess, the sludge of politics from all sides, which is not politics is really not a very logical thing, and it badly needs logic applied to it.
P.J. O'Rourke with Cato Institute Vice President David Boaz in 2020, talking about O'Rourke's book, A Cry from the Far Middle, Dispatches from a Divided Land. That from C-SPAN's video library. O'Rourke was an author and commentator. He died on Tuesday from complications of lung cancer, according to his publisher, at the age of 74. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Get more top Washington stories sent to you each day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word. Go to c-span.org/connect to subscribe. Hope you have a good night.